So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kent Lassman, and as the president at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, I'll be your host for a forum on law and policy today that affects every single American. We're going to uncover the story and its implications of how the Centers for Disease Control and the White House have conspired to strip property rights from people across the country. Now, property rights and all of the institutions that give them meaning are central to how we understand individual autonomy and the foundations of economic activity. Our friends at the New Civil Liberties Alliance have recently brought suit challenging a Trump administration order that prohibits the enforcement of rental contracts. The lead litigator for NCLA is Caleb Kruckenberg, and in just a moment, I'll ask him to explain the facts of the case and where it stands. Following a brief by Caleb, we'll be joined in conversation by CEI Senior Fellow Michelle Minton. Michelle's research on consumer choices and the regulatory constraints placed on what we put in our bodies and how individuals balance risks is timely in an era of increased public health awareness. And to bridge the gap between policymaking, agency overreach, and litigation, CEI's General Counsel Sam Kazman is going to jump in during today's conversation. Just a few administrative notes. We'll be recording the meeting and we'll make it available on YouTube. And to that end, I encourage you to share the program with your network of contacts. If you're watching live, I want you to be part of the conversation. Send me an email at events@cei.org or use the Q&A feature found at the bottom of your screen. In the course of an hour, I'll do my best to introduce your question to our panel. And finally, this conversation is the product of hours of research and effort by Caleb, Michelle, Sam, and the events team at CEI. I hope at the end of the program, you'll invest just 90 seconds in a short survey to help us understand how we're doing with the program and programming and what we can do to make it better. That's it on the administrative notes. Let's dive in. Caleb, welcome to the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Could you set the table for everyone? What the heck is going on at the White House with an executive order and evictions?
Well, thanks, and thanks for having me on this discussion. So over the summer, the White House issued an executive order, and it did a lot of different things. And I think a lot of people are probably familiar with one aspect of the executive order, temporarily rediverting certain funds for unemployment benefits. But buried in that order, the president told CDC to investigate whether a nationwide eviction moratorium would be appropriate. And from that, we really didn't hear much until September. And in the first week in September, the CDC issued a nationwide eviction order. And the order said that anyone who tries to evict a tenant for non-payment of rent using state law processes is now committing a federal crime punishable by up to $250,000 fine and a year in jail if they go through an eviction process. If that tenant signs a declaration saying, I'm unable to pay my rent because of coronavirus. And the moratorium lasts, according to the order, until the end of the year, until January 1, 2021. The order came out on a Wednesday. It was effective on a Friday, and that was Labor Day weekend. And fortunately, my organization, the New Civil Liberties Alliance, we jumped on that because this is, it's really outrageous to think of an administrative agency saying, we're just going to stop the operation of state law, which is the only way that someone who owns property can get back their own property when their tenants aren't paying. We're just going to stop it, and we're actually going to make it into a federal crime. We filed, like I said, this went into effect on a Friday, the Friday before Labor Day. We filed on the Tuesday after Labor Day. And our clients are just a series, they're a group of landlords across the country who are in a situation where they have tenants who just have not paid rent for a long time. Our first client, Rick Brown, he's a landlord in Virginia, and he has a tenant who hasn't paid rent since March. right now, his tenant owes him more than $9,000 in back rent. And because of various state moratoria on using court systems, he wasn't able to get an eviction order. But he went to court shortly before the CDC order was in effect. He started the process. He tried to get an eviction. And then the CDC basically said that if he goes through with it, he's now committing a crime. So he's stuck on the hook. He has to provide housing. He has to provide, water, gas, electric, all these things. But his tenant has no obligation now, legally, according to the CDC, to pay him any rent until the first of the year. And since we filed this lawsuit, I mean, we've heard from hundreds of landlords across the country, organizations representing property owners, but a lot of just individuals who have a situation where they have a tenant that's not paying. Maybe they have one property. One of my clients has a property he intends to retire into. And, they all have the same story. Their tenants have heard about the order and they've said, you know what, I'm not going to pay anymore because I don't have to, but you have to provide me housing. And if you don't, I'm going to sue you under state courts laws saying you have to provide me habitable housing, because that part of the state court system is still open. And so my organization, the New Civil Liberties Alliance, we deal with a much broader series of issues. We are founded really to push back against the administrative state in general. And this is a clear example for us of what can happen when an administrative agency is setting policy instead of, doing whatever it was envisioned for the agency by Congress. I mean, Michelle will talk about this later, but CDC is a public health agency. And suddenly we're in a situation where they're going out and they're saying, we know what's best to do housing policy. And we're going to make this sort of unprecedented order out of the blue saying the states cannot decide anything for themselves. They're not capable of addressing the coronavirus pandemic on their own. They can't have housing court, period. And we're just going to say that, for all the people who are unable to pay rent, the economic fallout for that is going to go to your landlord, the person that owns your home. They're just going to have to pay for you. That is not a decision we would ever expect the CDC to make. That's not a decision an administrative agency should ever be making. And, I think it really shows. It shows because this order just kind of came out of the blue and it's been chaotic. One of the interesting sort of pieces of fallout from all this is courts around the country, housing courts, shut down entirely. They wouldn't let people file paperwork. They wouldn't let people really do anything in the housing courts. And then the CDC has come back later and said, well, you could still open, you just can't evict people. And you sort of took what we said a little too strongly, which,
let me see if I can get you to introduce into the conversation here, into evidence for later. I want to turn to Michelle about this question of the CDC as an agency and its scope and purpose and those sorts of things that you've highlighted. But just for understanding for our audience, we're now less than 2 months on from this order. You've gone into court in federal district court, briefed and argued the case, yes, as I understand it. And you're in court in the Northern District of Georgia, which encompasses the home of the CDC. Is that right? Right.
Yeah. So we filed our lawsuit, like I said, just after the order went into effect. We sought a preliminary injunction, and we sued the CDC where they're headquartered. We went to Atlanta. We've now briefed it. We had an argument last week in front of the judge seeking a preliminary injunction, declaring the order invalid until we can get a final rule. We're still waiting for a decision. Obviously, we're very optimistic that the judge is gonna stay the order. But obviously, we're here in October, and every day that goes on, my clients and people across the country are affected by this. But even though the order as written stops being effective at the end of the year, I'm very concerned that the CDC is just going to extend it, because one of the things they say in their order is it's effective till the end of the year unless extended. And I don't know why they would say that if they weren't really planning to go forward.
So Michelle, let's get you in here on the character of the CDC. What is the agency supposed to be about? This is a corner of the federal government that most people don't pay attention to until very recently. So tell me, why are we seeing them in housing policy all of a sudden?
Yeah, and so first of all, I should say I'm not a housing policy expert, but I would argue that neither is the CDC, nor is any part of the CDC. They were founded as an organization originally called the Communicable Disease Center, and as you can tell by the name, the mission of this relatively small center in 1946 was intended specifically to focus on malaria, on communicable diseases like malaria, which was impeding the US World War II effort. Actually, the way it was worded is they were established to assist the states in controlling communicable diseases. And since 1946, obviously, the mission has expanded enormously. I think in the 1980s and the late 80s, the CDC's entire budget was around $600 million a year. And now we're looking at somewhere around $8 billion a year. And the way that CDC gets to that, and they also have about 10,000 employees, over 10,000 now. The way that this happened over a relatively short period of time is that the CDC went from focusing on communicable diseases, viral bacteria, those things, to all manner of issues that could even be tangentially linked to health, like obesity and diabetes, now traffic accidents, gun control, and now housing. And I think what we're talking about today with the housing issue is really indicative of how CDC has so massively expanded its purview, or it's making the argument. And honestly, this started in the 1950s, 1960s, where the entire public health community decided that health was not just protecting the individual from unwanted exposure to pathogens or viruses, that it included social health. We don't just want to have healthy people, we want to have healthy societies. And there's certainly an argument to be made that parts of the government should be keeping track of things like traffic accidents and stuff like that. But the CDC's core mission as an agency was to monitor and prevent and address communicable diseases. And the problem, we talk about mission creep and expansion, and what most people hear is money. And some people will say, oh, well, the US government has a ton of money. What's the harm in spending an extra couple $1 billion here or there for something that may or may not be important? The real problem with mission creep is that when you have it in an agency like the CDC or any other agency, it erodes their ability and their focus on their core mission. And obviously, we have seen that over the last year with the coronavirus. We saw it before with Ebola as well, that the CDC completely dropped the ball. And they weren't doing, they weren't focused and preparing for their core mission, which is to work with the states, educate other parties in public health, come up with standards and procedures for when there's an emergency. And it's particularly an emergency where the problems created by mission creep come to the fore, and you can really see what the problems are. So you don't just have a loss of focus on mission, you also have confusion and conflict between the agencies. So we're talking about housing. That's something you might think HUD would focus on, and now you have the CDC creeping in, and there might be mixed messaging. We saw that with CDC and FDA, where the CDC decided to get involved. There was an outbreak of vaping-linked lung injuries during the summer of 2019, and the CDC was saying, oh, it's all, avoid all vapor products. We don't know what it is. And the FDA was saying, well, it seems to be illicit THC vaporizer product. And for months and months, these two agencies were at cross purposes, and the public, they weren't getting the right messaging to know what to do in their real lives. And at CDC, for example, I think the Chronic Disease Project, which that includes things like obesity and diabetes, that's now their biggest single project besides perhaps the global AIDS and HIV prevention. But the Chronic Disease Prevention Unit at CDC shares its various missions, with about 10 or 20 other agencies, mostly at NIH. And so you have NIH, which has each individual institute at NIH has a larger budget than all of CDC, and you have experts in these issues, and they are sometimes at cross purposes with the CDC, which, you know, they come out with something, it's considered to be the authoritative statement on an issue. And so now we have, oh, go ahead, Ken.
This mission creep that you're describing is, it seems to me almost a perfect inversion, right? So an organization defined by statute to collect and distribute information primarily, and to aid states in the way they addressed communicable diseases, today is doing policy making instead of the collection and distribution of information that would be useful. And they're stepping in front of and preventing the implementation or execution of state law. So it's a perfect inversion of from where we were to what is happening on the ground. Sam, let me see if I can bring you into this, because you've worked on some other public health agency questions. Food and Drug Administration comes to mind especially, but this World War II era function being inverted, is there anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think you've got some interesting parallels. The CDC's powers all originated in a public health service law, I think enacted in 1944. CEI had its own encounter in court with another set of laws that also originated around that time, namely the New York rent control laws, which continued to be based on a post-World War II housing emergency. So, I mean, that's a joke line. An emergency that's been around for over half a century continues to be the basis for some strictures there. And I recall our experience when we came into court. We came in on behalf of a couple who had purchased a Greenwich Village townhouse, intending to use the laws that allow them to evict their rent control tenants so they themselves could live in that house as a family. Once they moved in, but before they could evict those tenants, the law was changed and they could no longer evict those tenants. And so we went into court, and one of the first questions from the panel was, didn't your clients realize they were buying property in New York City? As if once you realize that, that means forget about everything you may have thought you knew about property rights. And so in a sense, we've got CDC now saying, don't your landlords understand we're living during a pandemic? And that once again similarly wipes away any notion of property rights. And this is not just a rhetorical similarity. It's part of something that I call the medicalization of social issues, or at least that's what it was 10, 20, 30 years ago, when problems that in the past had been viewed as just issues of human existence, all of a sudden became medicalized. They became characterized as being due to some biological processes that could be controlled. And the control, of course, would come from people wearing white coats and stethoscopes from doctors. Well, now you've got the medicalization, not just of social issues, but of political issues. And if you do a little digging into what Dr. Anthony Fauci himself has been pushing for, an interesting article not too long ago, he writes about how the pandemic crisis requires us to engage in rebuilding the infrastructure of human existence, from cities to homes to workplaces to water and sewer systems. And what's the priority here? To prioritize those changes in human behavior that constitute risks for the emergence of infectious diseases. You won't find a word in there about property rights, about economics, about costs, about the Constitution. It is driven solely by this tunnel vision focus on reducing risk. Pathogenic risk is in fact the prime criterion that's going to guide us.
So Caleb, you've had briefs and you've had arguments. Does the CDC offer any sort of limiting principle, or can they do anything under this law?
The CDC certainly thinks they can do anything. And going back to the specific legal issues, there's a statute that was enacted in 1944 that says basically the CDC has the power if states are not taking necessary and appropriate measures to fight diseases, the CDC has the power to do certain things like quarantining livestock and destroying infected goods and things like that. And the CDC is relying on that statute to say, well, there's a clause in there that says we can do any other reasonably necessary thing. So that means we can do anything. There's no limit. And that means we can even shut down state courts. And the only requirement is that we, in our discretion and in our judgment, have decided that this might improve public health. Because the CDC has been very clear in their arguments and very clear in their briefing. They don't actually think shutting down housing court is somehow necessary or is an essential part of controlling the pandemic. What they've said is that they think it's possible this could potentially prevent at least one infection. And in their mind, that's enough to say we can do anything. And fortunately, there are constitutional limits and there are statutory limits, and that's why we have a case. I mean, I don't expect the court to buy that, but I think it's terrifying when you have an administrative agency coming into court making that kind of argument with a straight face.
So you mentioned that there are constitutional limits and constitutional constraints, and I'm remiss. So let me remind our audience. You're going to get a full hour of Kent's meandering questions until I get questions from you. So send me questions at events@cei.org or use the Q&A function. But I've got a full list of things that I want to hear you all talk about. Let me get back to this constitutional question. It seems to me that, and again, I want to pick up on something that Michelle mentioned that's easy to gloss over, and I don't think we should, that these agencies were, by design, Congress gave them an instruction to help states. And constitutional construction here in America typically reserves the powers and authorities of police powers, family law, public health issues. These things are reserved to the states. They're not a national or federal concern. So, for example, I wonder, why have we not seen, we have these cases popping up all over the place. Why have we not seen, or have you seen states coming into court to jealously protect their prerogatives? And why are states not pushing back against these federal administrative agencies that are so grossly overstepping the bounds?
Well, I think unfortunately, from what I've seen, the states aren't pushing back. And I think, part of that is just an acceptance of this kind of outsized role of the federal government and federal agencies. And I think there's a lot of just, well, there's a federal agency, they get to sort of push us around and that's what they get to do. That's what they do. But this is disturbing. This is disturbing on kind of a whole new level of federalism issues, where you don't even have Congress saying we're going to step into a traditionally state-regulated area. I mean, you have an administrative agency declaring that their invocation of a regulation is preclusive. It can change state law. And they're asserting this level of supremacy that I think is, it's certainly fundamentally inconsistent with the design of the Constitution. And I think it's really pushing this idea of supremacy, to an extraordinary level. And that is one of the claims that we have in our case, is that we're hoping, there are a lot of ways the court could resolve this issue, but we do think this presents very serious concerns about the scope of federal power, particularly when it's exercised by an agency.
And Michelle, you've written about, I want to get you in on this point, because I think it's really important about the vertical federalism that these separations. You've written about the pernicious effects of federal grants and in the flow of money. And I believe I'm putting words in your mouth, but something to the effect of the hollowing out of state and local public health resources, where there is that knowledge of particular time and place and local community standards. Is there anything to that as far as the CDC can push these states around because the states just haven't invested here?
Yeah, and that's something that I mentioned at the beginning, which I said the CDC was established to assist the states with their efforts to control infectious communicable diseases. And since in the 1940s, obviously that's changed a lot, where what you have now is the CDC. A lot of local and state public health departments receive most of their funding from CDC and NIH through grants. And those grants usually come with a mission focus determined by NIH and CDC. So rather than what we normally have, which are state public health agencies surveying their population, the needs of the populations, the threat to their particular state and population. For example, Hawaii is not going to necessarily have the same public health issues as Alaska or Ohio. And it really is the experts on the ground who should be determining where their focus is, what the most important and pressing needs are of the population that they're serving. But what you have with grants from CDC and NIH, et cetera, is they are setting the agenda for the states. And the health departments are built around those agendas. They hire people to serve those grants. For example, if the CDC says obesity is the biggest issue, then that local health department is going to hire experts on that particular issue. If tobacco is the issue, they're going to spend a lot of the grants that they receive in their budget addressing that particular issue and not necessarily preparing for something like a pandemic, which a lot of local health departments, local hospitals, everyone in the local public health world looks to CDC in those moments, expecting that what the CDC has been doing in all the years between epidemics is preparing for the next one. And unfortunately, that is not what CDC has been doing.
So this relates directly to a question from Alex in our audience. He asks, for any of you, if you have information on this, how does the CDC's budget break down in regard to funding infectious versus chronic disease?
I don't have the exact numbers right off the top of my head, but I believe chronic diseases make up the bulk of CDC's spending. And then you have global health issues, particularly AIDS and HIV, make up the next biggest chunk or a similar size chunk. But the amount of money spent on infectious diseases is under 10% of the CDC's budget. Planning, preparedness for pandemics, exactly what we're dealing with right now, less than 10% of their budget goes towards that type of issue. So CDC constantly, whenever with Ebola, with H1N1, now with coronavirus, you constantly get the political rhetoric that CDC is not funded enough. They don't have money. Their money's been cut. Their budget has increased enormously, 12% over the last 10 years. And like I said, in the 1987, it was only 600 million. We're at 8 billion now. The budget is not the problem. It's how they're spending it and how they're planning. It's their mission focus is the problem.
And I think maybe by implication, you're suggesting it's also the lack of accountability and oversight, right? So we have an entire branch of government that would be responsible for holding these people to their mission, and they have been, that legislative branch has not been paying attention. Sam, I have a question here from David that I think might be right up your alley. He writes, the CDC often makes recommendations through their task force on community preventative services. The task force is staffed by CDC employees. Could you comment on the legality of a supposedly independent task force that is driven by agency employees?
That's an interesting question. I think ultimately these task forces do not turn out to be independent, or if there are independent, it's only in name only. If these are CDC employees, they know that being able to push and advocate for things that are in accord with the current CDC mission, the current CDC directives, is probably the most important thing they can do in terms of their own careers, their own stability and well-being at the agency. And so in a sense, this quest for independent judgment is something that we're not going to see fulfilled when it's coming from any sort of entity that's got a relationship with the federal government, especially if that relationship is as strong as being staffed by employees of the agency that's paying the bill.
Caleb, I have another question about the specifics of your case here. This comes from Joel. He writes, it would appear that the CDC action is not even rationally related. And there he's using, as you know, the lowest standard of review for the federal court. Not even rationally related to the legitimate purposes of the CDC. The CDC appears to be claiming that evictions somehow increase the risk of infections, illness, or death. What is their evidentiary support for such a position? So what should they offer the court as evidence?
Well, they don't really have any evidentiary support at all. And, if you look at the order, what they have to point to is they have some information that they did a study where certain numbers of people in homeless shelters had self-reported that they were there because they had been evicted. And then the CDC has pointed to 2 studies that were done in cities that actually had eviction moratoria that suggested that people in homeless shelters had higher incidences of coronavirus infection. And from those 2 data points, the CDC has decided that, well, if you have lots of evictions, then people will become homeless. And if people become homeless, they'll end up in homeless shelters. And if they end up in homeless shelters, they'll have higher rates of coronavirus. And therefore, if you stop all evictions nationwide, then you won't have any of those problems. And that's it. I mean, there's not any evidence that would support this. There's not any kind of research that would even suggest that an eviction moratorium would have any effect on coronavirus infections at all. It's just, they're saying, well, that it just makes logical sense to us. And that's really all we have to do. We're an agency, we have white coats, we're doctors over here. You got to trust us on this.
So it seems to me there's a tension or something that's not quite resolved. There's a wonderful illustrative story in the New York Times about eviction moratoria and the effects there very recently. But on one hand, we seem to be, we're very quick to have the discussion about agency overreach, the lack of bounds, lack of accountability for what they're doing. They don't have expertise in these sort of trade-offs, economic, legal, property rights, contract rights. They have expertise in other things. So we point the finger at the CDC. But there's an awful lot of complaints at a political level initially, and then in different states with the governors and with the president, that this was just a political move, that they're trying to do something to help a group of people, renters, who are politically attractive protagonists in the narrative that they're trying to put out in a run-up to an election. So a governor puts a moratorium in place in order to protect a population that otherwise doesn't have a lot of protections. And they do so by taking away the rights and property of people that are not necessarily as attractive, people that are property owners, landlords. So which is it? Is it a crass political move, or is it just agency overreach? Can it be both?
Well, I think it's definitely both. And, this is just a pretext. And, obviously this is my opinion, but you look at this order, it is so flimsy. And this kind of reasoning is so flimsy where they're saying, well, we think it could probably help the pandemic. And the idea that they're going to come in and set housing policy, and like you said, really target a whole group of people who own property economically and just say, we're going to punish you to benefit people that we think are more attractive to the public. they're going to step in and do this, but they're not going to do anything else. I mean, there are, schools are open, businesses are open, bars are open in the communities that my clients have properties in. And the CDC has drawn this line. They've said, well, you can have school, you can have church, you can go to bars, you can go to restaurants. That's all fine with us, but you can't have housing court because the risk of disease is just too high. And obviously, that is not a sort of sober, consistent public health message. What it is it's an agency that is taking a political decision, and then they're taking sort of the heat off of Congress because they don't have to be accountable to the voters. And, members of Congress, the president, they don't have to go out and say, see, we've set this housing policy this way. We've chosen the winners, we've chosen the losers. And sorry if you own property, it's just too bad for you. They don't have to do that because they would face voters. But it's very easy for an administrative agency to do that. They could just say, we'll make that decision, why not?
And we're bringing us up to speed on the remedies, the potential remedies for this. Does it come right out of the CDC? Who pays back the landlords that have been paying their mortgages all of these many months?
Well, no one. And that's, that is really sort of the most outrageous part of all this is, if we're successful, the best we can hope for is a return to state law. My clients will now get their day in court that state legislatures have said they get. They don't get damages, they don't get anything like that. And they're never going to get money from their tenants. Because the whole point of this is these are tenants that don't have money to pay rent. They've said that. And, I think the lack of a remedy, the lack of any sort of consideration for the landlords, this is really why these kinds of decisions should be made by Congress. Over the summer in the CARES Act, Congress had a limited eviction moratorium as part of the CARES Act for certain federally subsidized housing, which, at least gives them some sort of jurisdictional hook, some kind of pretense that we can regulate this kind of housing. But even that, that was for federally subsidized housing. And there were provisions in there that gave relief to property owners. But here it's just sort of shifting the burden. It's saying, well, tenants are suffering, so property owners are just going to have to pay for it. And we're the government, and we're just going to order these other private citizens to pay the debts of other private citizens. And that's, it's really remarkable, and it's terrifying.
I wonder if I could jump in with a question for Caleb. So I assume that the CDC did not invite public comment in advance of issuing its order, but having issued its order, has the CDC taken any steps to ask for public comment at this point?
No. And not only did they not open it up for public comment, but as I mentioned earlier, it really took a lot of states by surprise, and it took a lot of people off guard. And, this hit the Federal Register on a Friday, and in housing courts across the country on Tuesday, judges had no idea what to do. Because if you look at the order, it seems like it's a crime to file paperwork. And so states were in real disarray. Property owners didn't know what to do. Judges didn't know what to do. The only word we've gotten from the CDC is they've issued a guidance FAQ on their website saying, well, this is how we interpret our order, so everybody should sort of calm down a little bit. Cynically, I think that's a ploy for the CDC to try to avoid some of the judicial scrutiny that they're getting. But it really hasn't changed much. I mean, I'm still hearing from clients all over the country, states don't know what they're doing. And there's just a lot of confusion. And the least you would expect is CDC to say, this is an emergency order, we're going to open it up, but we solicit comments, and please comment and tell us what you think of it. Particularly if they're considering extending this, which I think everyone expects them to.
We have a policy question here from Guy. this is a proposal that I'm unfamiliar with and hope that each of you can tackle. He says, GMU professor, George Mason University professor Garrett Jones has suggested restructuring the FDA and CDC in the Federal Reserve manner to be more independent of Congress and the president. Would such a restructuring insulate them from malign political pressures and moral panics, or would this lack of accountability worsen the situation?
And I'll start off with, I mean, it's an interesting idea that I haven't fully looked into, but what strikes me missing from that conversation about independence is the idea of controlling the budget for CDC, honestly. And I think that's where we get into a lot of the moral panic stuff. Most people don't realize that the CDC has to compete every year for its slice of the federal budget, and each project within CDC is fighting for their own slice. And there's no better way to get a big cut of a pie than to scream emergency, moral panic. I mean, that's really the best way to get Congress to open the purse strings. And then you have this sort of tit for tat where, you know, Congress says, well, we want to look good. We're going to election. People are angry. We want to do something that looks good, but we don't want to catch the heat for it. So you do it, CDC, you're kind of unaccountable unless we punish you. And then when they come back to defend their budget next year, then, you know, Congress will say, well, look at all this great stuff they did last year and how much they helped us through the pandemic. So let's give them, you know, this project of CDC an even bigger slice of the pie. So, I mean, unless the independence deals with this problem of the payola scheme kind of happening within CDC and Congress, I don't know if it would necessarily solve some of the major problems that we're talking about.
Well, and, you know, I'll jump in here. One of my organization's mission and what we are really founded on is, you see administrative agencies across the government, they continuously expand their jurisdiction, their actions, and independent agencies are some of the worst offenders. And what they're doing is they're taking over lawmaking responsibilities, adjudicatory responsibilities across the government. And Congress is letting them do that because Congress has no incentive to stop it. It's very easy to let an agency take over policy. You don't have to be accountable for it. And Congress is just very used to saying, you know what, we'll just let the agency fill in the details. They can figure this out later. And I think—
Let me press you on that, because it's tempting, but insufficient just to throw up our hands and say,
Sure.
you know, the Congress is going to look the other way and over delegate. What can an individual do?
Well,
right?
and
what
I think
can be done to change this dynamic?
Well, and that's where, you know, my group comes in. I mean, we are looking to the courts to push back, and we're trying to take away the tools of the administrative state sort of across the board. But the ultimate goal is, if we reduce administrative power, that forces Congress back to the position of doing its job. Because if they can't push it off on the agencies anymore, if the courts don't let them get away with it, then Congress suddenly, they actually have to address the problems, because they can't just ask CDC to set housing policy. Suddenly it's, you know, if they actually want to do an eviction moratorium, Congress has to do it. They can't just push it off somewhere. And so that's what my focus is. I mean, there's no perfect solution, obviously, but, you know, we're hoping that we can keep going to court. And that's, I mean, that's why a case like this is so important. You know, we need judges to say, this isn't going to fly anymore. You can't do this. You can't let CDC get away with this. And from this case, you know, we hope to keep building that precedent to put some real limits in place.
We've thrown around here a couple of times the term moral panic. And, you know, by implication, it lends itself to the idea that members of Congress or governors or other elected officials, you know, they become demagogic. They don't really root their arguments and their policy proposals in evidence, in the restrictions that we have in law that protect civil and economic liberties, but they really just pound the table and get everybody stirred up. The CDC has a track record with moral moral panic. Is this the final straw? You know, Michelle, do you think, are we about to break their habit? Do you predict that we need a fundamental restructuring of their purpose? What comes in 2021 and 2022, aside from the good work that is happening in these individual litigation efforts that can set the precedent and create some boundaries?
Yeah, like I said, I think the only way that this changes is if the incentive structure is changed. Because right now, CDC has every incentive to engage in moral panic talk, talking, like as I mentioned, saying the word epidemic, now pandemic is the best way for CDC to increase its budget, its importance, its power. And what we're seeing with the housing, it seems to just be, it's like a child trying to see what it can get away with. And if it gets away with it, then it's like, okay, I can do this thing now. Now, under my purview of public health is an economic issue, a housing issue. And Congress hands it off to CDC. And when CDC messes it up, because they're not housing authorities, they're not economists, they're not thinking in the long term of how, if you disincentivize people from being renters or people from renting out homes or properties, and that reduces housing, how does that affect public health in the long term? And when the effects of that policy begin to manifest, no one at the CDC is going to be blamed for it. They will just be given a mandate to do something about it. Again, their power will only expand because there's a new problem that we have to fix, HUD or CDC or whoever it is. Like I said, I think the incentive structure is a problem. I don't see it being fixed anytime soon. It really, court cases will do it. It would be great if we had members of Congress to hold CDC to their mission, to statutory obligations, that sort of thing. But Congress, unfortunately, is also incentivized to abdicate their responsibility, which is why the only time we see many things getting done in our country is through the court system, unfortunately. So I think if we're gonna roll it back, that's probably where it's gonna happen. Individuals can talk to the members of government, say like, I see what you're doing. You are abdicating your role in the legislature and voicing it onto the administrative state or allowing the courts to take over, when your job is to legislate and to create statute and to hold agencies accountable to statutory law. That's the only thing I can really see individuals doing, is paying attention and talking to their members of government. But at this point, it probably is up to the courts to start to roll some of this back.
So there's a really interesting point there that I want to underscore, just to make sure I understand what you said, and see if we can get it illustrated maybe by Sam or Caleb also. The desire to help renters, as I understand what you're saying here, Michelle, has produced policies that, because they are weakening contract rights, because they are increasing the risk premium for landowners or property owners who want to potentially lease out their property, is the intermediate and long-term effects are fewer housing options for people that need to rent. So it seems to me that the low end of the market, the housing market in the intermediate term, is going to get cut off, because those owners who could be leasing out, some of them are going to say it's not worth it to me because I don't know that I'm going to be able to maintain the contract because CDC might come marching in. Is that sort of perverse effect? It's common in rent control. It's part of the discussion with minimum wage. There's all these economic issues. Do I understand that correctly, Caleb?
Yeah.
Sam?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, and
Anyway.
I'll just point out, the CDC order doesn't stop foreclosures. So there's no real reason for it. They say we don't stop foreclosures. I have had multiple people call me and say, well, I'm just going to sell the property. That's the only way I can get out of this situation. I can't afford to stay in it. I'm going to sell the property, and that person's going to be on the street anyway. But it's not my problem anymore. I can't be in this market. I mean, that's the reality. And unfortunately, I think there's a lot of property management companies. There's a lot of small owners. They're going to just get out of the market. It's not worth it anymore. They can't make a living at it. And there is going to be a housing crisis, but it's going to be one that's caused by the order.
And fewer people will enter the market as well. You know, if I'm thinking, not a large property owner, but I'm thinking, well, I would like to buy a house in DC. I don't know if I'll fully be able to cover the mortgage, but I've got an extra, you know, basement apartment or whatever that I can rent out should the need arise. In this situation where I'm saying, okay, now the CDC can step in for any random reason, you know, valid or not, but they can come in and suddenly I won't have that source of income and not be able to afford a mortgage. Maybe I should just continue renting instead of purchasing a house and then potentially renting it out. So it could affect huge parts of the economy, of the housing market.
So in the area of rent control, Kent, those perverse incentives have long been noted in the economic literature. And in fact, decades ago, one economist put out the theory that short of carpet bombing, nothing is as effective in destroying areas of a city as rent control. And if I recall correctly, the Fraser Institute actually had a series of essays on rent control, and they interspersed them with photos on the one hand of areas of New York City, like the South Bronx, that had been devastated by rent control, compared with photos of cities that had been destroyed by bombing in World War II, but only at the back of the book could you find out which city was which. But physically, the devastation was identical.
Terrifying, terrifying. Okay, one of my jobs here is time management. We're headed toward, we're not quite at the top of the hour. So as we get into the last question here, I'm also going to invite each of you to provide any sort of wrap-up comments or takeaways that you have for our audience. And remember, this will be available on YouTube. So it's not just the folks watching today, but for weeks and months to come, we want to get the word out about this policy and its implications. I do want to ask one more time about kind of the political overtones here. There is an election next week in many states, most states, and there's certainly the national election going on. Is this I just want to get a handle on, is this something that we're going to be saddled with after this particular coronavirus is handled? So the CDC, are we suddenly going to see a new office of the CDC focused on housing policy? And the political drive to, as Sam said early in our program, transform everything into political questions and not just health questions. First medicalization and then politicization of these policy issues. Is this something that you expect we will be saddled with and you'll be fighting housing initiatives out of the CDC for years to come? Or is it a one and done problem because of the politics and the timeline and the calendar of this year's election? So Caleb, maybe I'll go to you first, and then Sam, ask you to offer your wrap-up comments as well.
Sure. So as I said before, I think the timing and the way this is presented, very clearly to me at least, is a political action by the CDC. It's easy to score cheap political points. We're helping out people. That's how they can present it. And they never even have to acknowledge the harm that they're causing. It's very easy for them. But that, I think, is kind of a unique situation. Maybe we won't see that again, or maybe we won't see that again for a while. But the real problem is, okay, now the CDC, they've got it on the books. They can do this. Okay, we can set housing policy. Why not? We can do anything we want to. That's our position. And if the courts bless that, then they have no reason to stop that. And they say, well, we'll just keep doing it. The easiest way to do it is we'll just keep extending this eviction moratorium. I wouldn't expect, no matter who becomes president, I wouldn't expect President Trump to reverse this policy, and I wouldn't expect President Biden to either. I think they would both see this as something that they could just keep going. Why not? This is easy, and we can achieve our policy goals there. And so, and it's something we see across the government. It's something we see in lots of different agencies, which is why, from my perspective, it is so essential to go to court now and shut this down, because it's essential that the courts don't allow this kind of behavior to continue without any sort of questioning.
Sam, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, well, I think Caleb is absolutely correct in terms of the necessity for court action, because in a sense, they're really the only branch of government we can count on here. The allure of helping tenants at the expense of landlords is incredibly strong. We've witnessed it not just for decades, but in one sense for centuries. And a big part of that allure, of course, is that you as a politician can help tenants all you want, but if it's paid for by landlords, it never appears as a budgetary item, as a taxpayer item, where taxpayers can decide, yeah, we want to spend money on this, or no, we don't. It's sort of a, hey, why not approach. And so I think it's really essential that we get something out of the courts that keep this from happening, because otherwise eviction measures, measures to stop evictions, to restrict them, are going to become part and parcel of every pandemic preparedness package that we see prepared in the future.
And
That's
Michelle,
prospect.
Michelle, I want to give you the last word before I give some notice about what our next programming looks like for the audience.
Yeah, I mean, I just agree with Sam and Caleb that the courts stopping this is absolutely essential, because CDC will just continue to do this when and wherever it feels necessary, and continue to expand its powers, its budget, etc. And and not focusing on what it needs to be focusing on during a pandemic. Why are they, not to say that the housing issue is not important, that evictions are not important, but that should not be what the CDC is spending its valuable time, our money, and its expertise on. And I think, the CDC failed us. It failed in preparing America for the pandemic we're currently experiencing. We should not reward them by giving them broader powers and more money to interfere with the lives of Americans. They need to be penalized somehow, either through the courts striking down this sort of action, or honestly, I mean, Congress needs to come in and force the CDC to pare itself down towards its core mission.
Well, I think you all understand how important I find this. I will not repeat your closing remarks, but I would underscore this is also about that core fundamental understanding of the role that contract and property plays in a healthy society, not just in the way our economy works, but in understanding our rights as individuals and the place that we play in our government structure. I want to thank you all. Caleb, we will be providing as much assistance as you ask for in the coming months, wishing you to prevail. I look forward to your success on the courthouse steps, announcements soon enough. Michelle and Sam, thank you very much for this. I want to let everyone know that we have 2 new book forums scheduled for next month. On the 10th of November, I'll be joined by dear friends to CEI, Ron Bailey and Marion Tupy. Their new, just a lovely coffee table style book, chock full of information. We will be talking about 10 global trends every smart person should know. And then fast forward a week to Wednesday, the 18th, we'll be back here at CEI again with Kevin Williamson, author for his latest book, which is called Big White Ghetto, Dead Broke, Stone Cold Stupid, and High on Rage in the Dank Woolly Wilds of Real America. Kevin is always a treat, and certainly one of the best wordsmiths we know. Again, thank you all. And for our audience, I'd appreciate 60 to 90 seconds of your time to give us some feedback. That's our program for today. We'll look forward to seeing you again soon.